You're photographing bright white snow and the picture comes out gray. Or you're photographing a dark night scene, and not only does that picture come out gray also, but there's a lot of noise and you have a little bit of blur because the shutter speed was too slow. You can correct for all of this by understanding the exposure compensation feature, a vital feature found in every camera that's often not used at all by beginning photographers and is misunderstood by others. Exposure compensation may be that dial on top of the camera labeled something like -3 to +3, the scale in your viewfinder labeled the same, and you may have a small button on your camera with the plus or minus sign. These ways of changing exposure compensation are so important that it's right there as one of the main camera controls. So check your specific camera manual to see how you change it. But let's back up and look at how exposure is calculated in the automatic exposure modes, like auto, program auto or P, aperture priority or A, and shutter priority or S or TV in some cameras. In these modes, the camera is calculating some combination of exposure triangle variables, aperture, shutter, and ISO, depending on the mode that you're in to give you a proper exposure. And if you need a refresher on the exposure triangle, I'll link to my free exposure triangle course so you can review that. But what is a proper exposure? How does the camera know what that is? After all, that's the whole point of these auto exposure modes. You control one exposure variable and you let the camera calculate the others for a proper exposure. But the problem is that the camera doesn't know what you're photographing. It doesn't know that you're photographing bright snow or a dark night scene. So it's just going to guess that what you're photographing should be a middle gray tone, somewhere in between white and black. And that's why, if you're not using exposure compensation, bright white snow looks gray, and that dark night scene also looks gray. Now let's take a look at this demo that you can try out for yourself. Go find a large black object and a large white object, like a wall or a piece of paper. I have two V-flats set up in the studio. Leave your exposure compensation at 0. I'm splitting the two down the middle, and they both look like they should. I'm going to move the camera over to the white side and fill the frame entirely. And notice how it's getting darker, turning gray. Then as I move over to the black side, that brightens to gray. Compare the two photos, and they both look more or less the same. Gray. Neither of those are correct for what the photo should look like. And this is where exposure compensation comes in. Exposure compensation is a way for us to tell the camera how much brighter or how much darker our scene is actually supposed to be compared to that middle gray. That's it. Think of it that way and you'll never mess it up again. Should the scene be darker than middle gray? Set a negative number. Brighter than middle gray? Set a positive number. So go back to your white object. Set exposure compensation to +2 and capture the photo. And now that picture should look closer to what it looks like in real life. Go to that black object. Set exposure compensation to -2 and capture that photo. That black object should now look closer to black. Go ahead and leave it at -2 and go back to your white object and capture the photo again. That white object will now appear black. That's because you told the camera it should be black via having the exposure compensation dial at -2. The camera just adjusted the exposure variables to do that, to give you what you asked for, because it doesn't know any better. It doesn't know what the scene is. It doesn't know that it's white, so it made it darker than middle gray, because that's what the exposure compensation was set to. So your next question is, what do those numbers mean, or which number should I set? Those numbers are stops. If 0 is gray, then -1 is 1 stop darker than middle gray, or half as bright. +1 is 1 stop brighter than middle gray, or twice as bright. I did a video a couple of weeks ago all about stops that you can check out if you want to learn a little more about those. But the number that you set should be based on a mix of how reflective your scene is and how bright or dark you actually want it. Maybe you want the snow to look gray, I don't know. But here are some starting points. And I want to emphasize starting points. It will all depend on how reflective or bright your situation is and how bright or dark you actually want it, like whether you want to expose for the shadows, the midtones, or the highlights. For candlelit interiors or night street photography, start around -2. Dark green vegetation, start around -1. A midday blue sky, average daytime landscapes, and daytime street photography, you can just leave it at 0. Cloudy overcast skies are somewhere around +1. Snow under overcast skies and sandy beaches are close to +2. And then snow under direct sunlight is usually around +3. All you need to do is get it close, especially if you're recording the RAW file. This will give you much more latitude in post-processing by getting your initial exposure close. And you can use other things like your camera's histogram, but that's a topic for another day. What I hope you got out of this video, though, is that the exposure compensation dial is for you to tell the camera how dark or bright to make that scene in relation to a middle gray tone. The higher the number, the brighter you're telling the camera to make it. The lower the number, the darker you're telling the camera to make it. Now, if you have any additions or questions, please leave them in the comments section. Be on the lookout for more photography tips like this every week, and I'll see you in the next video.